Hi everyone, welcome to a presentation on student voice. It's great to be part of the SALC network and be talking about student voice after a session that was run a few weeks ago. My name's Sophie Murphy. I will be talking about student voice. I've got on my first slide my Twitter account, so you can access more resources there or say hello to me there, and my email, my direct email at the University of Melbourne. So today we're going to be talking about student voice. We've got about an hour together, and we're going to go through a whole series of things in an area that has really come to fruition, and we're really digging deep and finding out a lot more about student voice. So today, in this hour, we're really going to consider a number of things. And so we'll be looking at definition of student voice and agency. And I really want us to consider how we propose and how we seek and find and attain meaningful and purposeful talk for our students, how our students can speak to their peers and with each other, and how you as a teacher in a classroom can use your teacher voice and use your teacher talk to effectively have dialogue and discourse with students. Teaching students about essential listening skills and thinking and modelling and hearing all voices in the classroom. So often when we think about student voice, it's not just one or two students with the loudest voice. How do we actually access all student voice and all student thinking in the classroom? We'll be looking at effective meaning making and moving from surface to deep. So again, these are words and vocab that we're hearing a lot in a lot of Victorian documentation, particularly from the department in the high impact teaching strategies, about moving from surface to deep. John Hattie's work has talked about this for a long time in moving from surface to deep and the importance of both surface and deep and moving there at the right time. We'll be looking at effective classroom practices, dialogic teaching and discussion. So we'll be finishing today with some really practical examples of how we can enact student voice in the classroom. And importantly, that very important link between feedback and teaching students how to give feedback, both to themselves and also with peers and you as a teacher. So I just want to start off today with some thoughts and some considerations here, and really defining and working out what our own definition of student voice is. So I really want you to take about 10 minutes, and if you can pause the video in a moment for about 10 minutes, and hopefully you'll be watching this with a colleague and you can have this discussion with a colleague and perhaps write down some points yourself. We will certainly be going through this over our time together, but I really want you to have a think about at this starting point of how do you define student voice and agency? What does student voice and student agency look like in your classroom and really quite holistically at your school? Do you have a definition of this? Is it something that you consider? Do you explicitly plan for student voice and student agency? Is it something that you consider and talk to your colleagues about how you're going to use student voice within your planning documentation? And how can you use student voice to support student agency? So student voice, as we'll uncover, is the much greater whole school voice, and student agency being much more aligned to the classroom. So I want you to just stop and pause for a moment and give yourself about 10 minutes to talk to your colleague at the moment. If you're watching this with someone, or if you're watching it by yourself, pause and have a think about those questions and have a think about what you think this may look like. And if it's something that you haven't considered, it's certainly something that by the end of this session, you'll have a lot more insight into. So please pause and we will take it from there. Okay, now we're back, and I hope that you've had that chance to jot down some points, have some really robust discussion. We're going to look at a bit of what the research tells us, about teacher talk, and a bit of what the research tells us about student voice. just to give you a little insight into my passion in this area, I was a K-12 director of learning at a large independent school in Melbourne, and I'd been teaching for about 15 years. I started my master's about 7 years ago with John Hattie, and one of the things that really resonated when I started hearing him speak at conferences and get to know his work and read Visible Learning. And I started my master's at the same time that he'd released Visible Learning for Teachers. And one of the fascinating components in one of my first conversations that I had with John was about the mind frame of dialogue versus monologue. And interestingly, I remember this conversation well, where as a teacher who talks too much, I kind of explained it to John as my superpower. I felt like I love to teach, I love to talk. And he told me at the time, well, you're not the only one, Sophie, because all teachers love to talk, and let's have a look at the research. And as I started to look at the research and unpack what that was, and my master's work was specifically about student perceptions of teacher talk. So what did students think about teachers talking too much? John asked me in that first initial meeting, what do you think your students say about you talking all the time? And I thought, oh gosh, I actually don't really know. I've never thought about it. I just thought they smile at me and they nod, and so surely they're engaged. And I was a bit horrified for a moment, and I thought, oh my goodness, what if they're looking out the window and they're just passively listening to me talk? And I'd never asked them what they thought about my talk. So as I delved into the research, and as I created a research journey for my master's thesis, some interesting results emerged. It wasn't necessarily about dialogue versus monologue. It ended up being that of the 600 students that we surveyed and asked them about teachers, interestingly, all of the students said that they disliked teacher talk, but a small group, and it was a significant group, who disliked teacher talk the most, actually said they wouldn't change anything about the way that a particular group of teachers talked or spoke in their classroom and the different type of discourse. So it really led to, okay, well, what's the next step? And that was the end of my master's. So I continued on with a PhD, delving more into teacher talk, but also having this passion and drive for student voice and the nature of what are students talking about in our classrooms. I certainly was a talker when I was at school and talking, but I was fascinated, and the work of Graham Nuttall, a New Zealand academic who is no longer with us, and his PhD student, Adrian Alton-Lee, they really looked at students and what students were talking about. So this was my beginning of a journey into student voice and teacher talk. They align very closely. But going back to the research, teachers talk for about 90% of the lesson, with about 85 to 90% being surface level. It's really important that we understand exactly what surface level means. So we're going to get to that with something called the solo taxonomy. 90% of the lesson. Now, I was involved in some research at the University of Melbourne with Professor Janet Clinton in a project that used an app called the Visible Classroom or Visible Classroom, and it captured the discourse of teachers. And interestingly, as I was coding this many years ago, for one lesson, there may be 25 to 30 pages of teacher discourse that I was coding time after time after time. And I could see that it was surface level. So it seems like such a large statistic of 90%. But time and time again, as teachers evaluate their practice, they too say, gosh, I am actually speaking that much. So definitely evaluate your practice and see whether you are similar and aligned to all of that research. And that's been going on for a long time. That statistic it really dates back to over 100 years ago, when educational research, when they were actually looking at the amount of teacher talk, that the same statistic still stands. Interestingly, some students go without speaking for the whole day, and that's quite a scary thought, I think. But for some students, it's actually what they want, so they don't want to communicate. And interestingly, Nystrand, who does a lot of work in the area of teacher questioning, found that students were, on average, only asking about 2 questions per day, on average, all of our students. So if we look at the amount of the amount of questions that teachers are asking, they're actually asking anywhere between 250 to 350 questions a day. So if we think about that with our 2 questions, it's really not enough. So we need to think about how can we bring student questioning in, but really purposeful student questioning. And again, we will talk about that throughout this session. This last little blue dot here on this slide is a really, really interesting piece of research. And as I mentioned, Graham Nuttall's work with Adrian Alton Lee, there's many different components and different parts of the research that they did as they mic'd up students, secondary students, for many, many years, and they listened to that discourse that they had on their little tiny Sony recorders. One of the most interesting for me that I find is that 80% of feedback is actually given by peers, so is actually taken on by peers, and about 80 to 90% of that is inaccurate. So it really showed that notion of we really need to teach our students how to give each other feedback, because they're going to be doing it anyway and they're going to be taking it on. So we want them to be able to do it in a more accurate way. We need to support students in where they are, where they need to go and how they're going to get there, and that all important where to next. And as this title on the slide says, to hear student voice, we can't dominate the discourse. Here at the University of Melbourne, we get to experiment and get to do some extraordinary research. Part of my PhD research with the Science of Learning Research Centre was the interactive classroom that the Science of Learning Research Centre were responsible for. This picture here is, you can see glass and you can see some a reflection of tables. That glass, in fact, is a two-way mirror. So much like Big Brother, it's a two-way mirror. You can see some cameras up there. And we actually brought some students in to hear the discourse. So much like Graham Nuttall's research, we, for my PhD, were able to bring in 3 different groups and listen to a surface, a deep and a transfer lesson to really hear what students are talking about. And we have so much data that we're going through at the moment to really capture and listen to what's happening. This is what it looks like on the other side. Oops. So on the other side, we have behind the screen, behind the classroom, many TVs, many microphones that are capturing the discourse of the students. And so what we were able to do is, as you can see here, where there's a classroom inside and you can see all of the TVs at the top, we were able to listen and capture each student speaking and then do a full analysis on that to really capture the heart of student voice. As I said earlier, when we look at the notion of surface to deep and the importance of surface to deep, in the lessons that we took students into in these classrooms, we had 3 different lessons: a surface lesson, a deep lesson, and a lesson that brought together both surface and deep to see if there were any significant differences. What I think works exceptionally well, and some people use Bloom's taxonomy. I certainly did when I first started teaching, but the issue with Bloom's is it was created in the 50s, 1956, in a university context, and it has complexities which makes it difficult to be able to share with the students. And anything that we want the students to be able to become a part of and really live, we need to share that language. So the solo taxonomy allows us to have a simple and robust framework that moves from surface level to deep level. So let me explain how the solo taxonomy works. So it has 5 levels of understanding, and this particular slide, and you will actually get a PDF copy of this particular slide, because I find that it works really well with teachers, particularly that third column, which is the verbs. Now, I've created these, put the verbs into this table, but there are many other words that you may use, and many that you might find are more significant to what you're actually teaching. So these are not all of the words, and of course some can shift from one area to another. So the idea is that pre-structural is where the student hasn't learnt about this. They haven't been exposed to it. So even using that Carol Dweck notion of not yet, they haven't achieved that yet, but only because they haven't learnt that yet. Unistructural is one idea. So they know one singular idea. And we want students, when we use the solo taxonomy particularly, it's really, really great to use to support a success criteria. So 4 steps in a success criteria. In that very first step of being able to identify or define are 2 that I really like there. It gets everyone on the page. If we talk about something that students have not been exposed to, they're all able to define or identify once they've been exposed to that information. Multistructural, there's several ideas. So students know several ideas or pieces of information. If we think about it from a Lego point of view, unistructural being one piece of Lego, like a yellow piece of Lego, multistructural being a red piece, there's a blue piece, there's a yellow piece, and they all stack on top of each other. And this is where we students are describing things, or they're listing things. And often this is where it stops. In our very crowded curriculum, this is where it stops, or this is where a lot of the language sits that our students are talking about. As we move into relational, so why I bring my hands together is many ideas then come together to become relational. And the verb that I really like there is to compare and contrast, to look at similarities and differences, because we need to have a really strong understanding of what that is. This is where the differences between surface and deep come in. We need that yellow zone thinking. We really need that surface level. It's as important as the deeper level. A Lego context, this is where we're using a box of Lego, and we're using the instructions to guide our practice. Extended abstract is where we're evaluating, we're predicting, we're constructing, we're designing. But most importantly, we're transferring our learning from one context to another. So if we go back to that Lego example, this is where we use all of that knowledge to create something new, to create something, not just a whole bunch of Lego together, something specific and something that we're able to create using our knowledge. And so that's what we want students to do. And we want students to engage in this language. And when we go too quickly into the deep zone or the green zone, things are really difficult for students. And so they need to go back into that yellow. But we don't want to keep students in the yellow. We want to support them in progressing through surface to deep. And as I said, it works exceptionally well in creating success criteria. We want this language, we want this shared language from prep to 12, so that students know and can use these words to be able to move them from surface to deep, so they can have the conversations with each other, with their parents, and particularly with their peers. So I really like this quote. This quote actually was in the student voice and student agency document Amplify. It's by David Perkins, who's an Australian educational leader, and he really talks about educating for the unknown, and he will often talk about leading into the 21st century. And if you've heard John Hattie speak, he would say, well, I hope that we've got this right by now, because we're near 20 years into the 21st century. So we want to make sure that we're doing this well. But one thing that does come up over and over is that we are educating for the unknown, and we're moving at a rapid pace. And so this quote by David Perkins allows us to think about that last line in the quote particularly about meaningful learning. And so the importance of focusing on transfer and deep learning in an ever-changing world, we need to help students make connections and create meaningful learning through the language that they use with each other. So having these structures that are simple and robust, such as the solo taxonomy, it really helps us frame our progression of our lessons, our lesson sequences, so that we can ensure that we are moving students from surface to deep. It goes much more than what are we learning today. So as we go through and really start to unpack what student voice is, with that last quote from David Perkins, the important part of students absolutely being a part of this, students being empowered to use their voice. And the document Amplify that was in, and this definition actually comes from Amplify, really highlights what they believe, what their definition of student voice and student agency is. And if you're looking at educational research in the area of student voice, it's a little bit ambiguous, because student voice and student agency can be wrapped into one. And so there's quite a big misconception about what it is. And again, where we want our students, and what we want our students to do, is to really have a strong understanding of what voice and what agency means to the school, to the classroom, and to them. So the definition from the Department of Education from last year, from the document Amplify, says that student voice is not about simply giving students the opportunity to communicate ideas and opinions. It's about students having the power to influence change. Authentic student voice provides opportunities for students to collaborate and make decisions with adults around what and how their learning is assessed. This is then known to lead to improved educational outcomes. And as I started to unpack this is where student voice is often seen as things like this within a school context. So student representative councils, different school committees, school leadership comes into this for specific students, so not for all students. Student-led forums, student-led assemblies, contributions from students either at staff meetings or as part of policy or part of planning or school publications, and then seeking student opinions and viewpoints in a variety of ways. So student voice is very big. It's very much owned by a whole school, but often it's not to every student in the school. So my passion is more along the line of student agency, but we really can't have student agency without student voice. So to define it is really important. So student agency refers to the level of autonomy and power that a student experiences in the learning environment. Student voice and student agency are intrinsically linked. Agency gives students power to direct and take responsibility for their own learning, creating independent and self-regulating learners. And we hear this word self-regulation a lot. And it is when students really know where they are, where they need to go, and how they're going to get there. What this looks like a lot as we move through this is them having a really strong understanding of what self-regulation is, and that they have a capacity to make choices and develop understandings. This is where student voice should be visible, and where we are using thinking routines and structures and feedback to really connect to our students within a classroom context. So the language here really matters. The notion of surface to deep really matters here, to really empower students with the language of learning. And of course, we're going to have a look at what this leads to in more of a educational context, and who is talking about this. So John Hattie says also in Amplify that when students become invested in their own learning, they gain a better understanding of what is good and the purpose of it. They're able to evaluate their work, more purposefully discuss progress and achievement with teachers. So when we're talking about the notion of growth, and 1 year of school, 1 year of growth for 1 year of schooling, that students are really aware of what that actually means. And all of these above have a significant effect size on achievement. Johnson, who in 2014, a lot of his work was around the notion of student voice and student agency, and he created and generated a positive cycle of success. He said that students with a strong sense of agency have all of these things: have greater focus, more interest, have grit and perseverance. They're going to be less likely to give up. They're better at from the planning stage. They're going to choose challenging tasks. They're going to set higher goals, have improved concentration, and actually work harder. So his research was very much focused around these areas, and this was over a number of years. His research showed that when students did have a strong sense of agency, that these things happened. This was really closely aligned to the work of Russell Quaglia, who writes a lot and has got wonderful, wonderful resources that are free on his website, and I will attach that to this video with many of the resources that I'm talking about as well, that you'll have access to. But he talks about 4 very specific areas: self-worth, engagement, purpose, and motivation. And he says, and he really brings the notion of student voice, agency, and leadership together as one. So often it comes together as one, which sometimes is a little bit confusing when we're trying to separate it. From my perspective, I really like when we unpack the difference between voice and agency and leadership, because we want all of our students to become leaders in their learning, much like us as teachers. So what Quaglia found, and he has so many resources that are free, as I said, but that students were 4 times more likely to develop self-worth, 8 times more likely to be engaged, 9 times more likely to see the purpose in their learning, and 7 times more likely to be academically motivated. So these are his words about what he found in areas that he looked at when student voice and agency were brought to the forefront. So it's really interesting and obviously very powerful when we do this correctly. It has an enormous effect size. So what should we do about it? Well, I think that as a starting point, understanding the terms of student voice, agency, and leadership, and Amplify being a Victorian document is a wonderful, wonderful place to start, being an Australian document, and really leading the way. So it is in draft form. It's the first iteration of it. But I do think it's got some wonderful definitions and great quotes in there, and great research that's attached to that document. So what processes is your school putting in to really have an understanding of student voice? Is it embedded in as a whole school? But as teachers who are watching this, and not just leadership who are watching this, I think that there's a really important component here that we can actually have significant impact in the classroom in understanding how we can use student voice effectively, or student agency. So I think that there is both, and both should be considered. But as a teacher, I think that impact can be certainly made. So this is a little bit hard to read, but I will go through each one. So if it's evident, if student voice and agency is evident in a classroom, we'll be able to see students visibly sharing ideas, opinions, and thoughts regularly. They will be listening to each other. They'll be asking questions, so it won't go back to that no questions or only 2 questions. They'll be asking questions to strengthen their understanding from self, peer, and their teacher. They'll be seeking, and they'll actively be seeking feedback from teachers and peers. So remember, it's not just from teachers. We're going to bring this notion of peers together and reflect or evaluate their learning experiences. They will be giving feedback to peers and also to teachers, negotiating learning goals and assessment. So this doesn't mean that what they say goes. It means that under the context of a very strong clarity of instructional practice, that they're able to negotiate their goals and assessment. So The teacher will be looking at differentiation when you're using a surface to deep success criteria, but they will know where they sit within that. However, they'll still be challenging themselves respectfully, challenging themselves and others. But most important, having an opportunity to feel confident and to contribute in such a meaningful way, and have this shared sense of ownership. But the teacher really directing that learning, not students taking over that. So we don't want to go too far with that. So what is student voice is not. And it's really important that we do have a look at this, because when we look at exactly what student voice is, it's really important that we look at what it isn't as well. So it's not silent. And often I think about my own teaching practice when I was in the classroom, and I would say, and perhaps for a more behavioural management side of things, that when I had spoken for a long period of time, that now the students had to work silently. So if I was evaluating my own practice, I know that I did that a lot. But as a learner, I really needed to talk through things to really understand. So student voice and student agency in a classroom is not going to be silent. It's not going to be led by student only. It is going to be led by teachers, and their connections as a starting point to what they need to teach from Australian or Victorian curriculum, if you are a Victorian teacher, and then going through that process of backward by design to really guide students through that process of learning. But it is not led by students. So we need to really understand that whilst we enact student voice, that it's not students taking complete ownership of professional teaching. So therefore, it's not unstructured, it's not random, it's not only one or two students, it is all students. And the students in my initial master's survey, one of the things that they said about the teachers who they wouldn't change anything were that these teachers were really sharing the discourse. So whether it was the highest achieving student or a student who struggled academically, the teachers were very fair and consistent, not just outlining or pointing out students at either end of the academic spectrum. It's not only in specific subjects, and it's not just student choice or free choice. So it's really important that we really have a look at that. So just, if you wouldn't mind just taking a minute again, reflecting on what student voice is not, what student voice is. So just taking a moment just to consider your own practice, and taking a minute to turn and talk to the person that you're watching this video with, or perhaps take some notes if you're watching it yourself. So we've come to the point here where we're really going to unpack some practical strategies. And in our first session of teachers coming in to the university, the teachers who were looking at student voice initially really wanted to get some great practical strategies to go back to the classroom. And this is a snapshot of some, so I will be putting more up, and certainly you are welcome to email me or contact me directly, or look on Twitter, or look on this website, because there will be certainly more strategies being put up in the way of how you can use student voice and student agency in the classroom. So let's explore a few. And if you've got a few more and you've got great strategies, I would love it if you could email me so that we can share them with everybody as well. Or perhaps you'll try one of these strategies and it doesn't work, or it does work. I would love to hear about it too. So thinking routines and structures for talk are really important. So using protocols to structure dialogue and discourse through dialogic discussions, Socratic questioning, and routines are key. So it's not just the notion of it being random. It's not just go back to your tables and have a discussion. So the team at Harvard Project Zero, so if you haven't heard of it, again, I will send through the link to Harvard University, the Project Zero team. They talk a lot about the notion of visible thinking, And in that, they actually talk a lot about specific thinking routines, but they're also known as protocols, thinking protocols or talk protocols. And so in the educational literature, they're not just at Harvard Project Zero. There you can find them in lots of different places, but Harvard Project Zero have certainly compiled them, and they're on their website, and you can access many more. However, I would caution you just to, if you're not familiar with them, just to think about perhaps a couple that you can master and a couple that your students can get to know the language. And I'm sure that many of you are using some of these strategies and protocols already. So a couple of my favorites here, and there are hundreds of them, but a couple of my favorites are these. So a see, think, wonder. What do you see? What does it make you think about? And what are you wondering? Is a specific structure that you can give students of any age. So when you have a structure like this, or it might be a Connect Extend challenge for older students, or circle of viewpoints, they're very similar in the structure that you outline. You don't just use these words, you outline some questions underneath, and I will attach these to the video so that you can go through these structures and give them a go. Chalk talk is really interesting, and I've used this in a variety of contexts. Chalk talk is probably my favorite as the teacher who talks way, way, way too much. Chalk talk means that everybody has to stop talking. Why is that good? Because what you're actually doing is on big pieces of butcher's paper, or if you don't have table space, you can use the big post-it sticky notes. But you write down a question or a provocation, and you give everyone a marker. Now, if you're using it with students, it can be a great formative assessment tool by giving specific students specific colour markers, but usually it is anonymous. What it is you might have 8 tables in the room with then 8 provocations on butcher's paper that you're writing a question or a provocation. The students then have, or the teachers, if you're going to do it with staff, have about 5 to 10 minutes to go around and write on each of the questions or provocations. They can write words, they can write pictures, they can draw pictures, they could read somebody else's and tick, but basically they have to contribute to every single one that you have written. So they have to walk around in silence, not in any particular order, but it must be silent. So no even whispering at all. But the idea is that after 5 or 10 minutes, that you have every single person in the room, every single person, you have their thoughts and their ideas. I've done this at conferences where you can have over 100 people doing it. Done it in different elite sporting contexts with coaches and sportsmen. You could do it, and sportswomen, and you can do it in a variety of settings from very early on, from prep right through to year 12 as well. So it's a fun one. The important part of this is, though, once you have the data, which is what everyone's thoughts and opinions are, it needs to go back to each table to then be analysed. So how do we analyse it? Well, we might look for keywords, we might underline or circle keywords, and then we share back to the group. So that the students need to know that once we've collected everybody's voice, there is an analysis, and you're going to, as a small group, share back to the whole group. It does take time. It may take a whole lesson, but the power in collecting that data is enormous, and certainly can be used with adults and children alike. And it's a wonderful one. I will post more about that on this website so you can read a little bit more about it and have it carefully explained. And again, I'm happy to speak to anyone about this who's really interested in that. Colour symbol image is another one of my favourites. It's a non-verbal thinking routine and a point of discussion for students to have together. If you're in a school that has a lot of non-English speaking students, or if you are in any context at all, and I've used this with adults as well as children. So it might be at the beginning or at the end of a unit, but you're asking the students to say, well, what colour does this bring to mind, and what symbol and what image would you relate to this? So it is about an articulation of, it's quite a deep thinking routine, because it's about putting all of those singular ideas together to come up with a color, a symbol, an image. The cool thing about this and the wonderful thing about this is that, and all of these thinking routines, is that there's no understanding, or there's no answer that the teacher has that has to be answered in that specific way. It opens up thinking, it opens up that whole idea of deep level learning. But we need to ensure, as I said when I was going through solo, that we're going through from surface to deep. 2 stars and a wish is a great one from prep, so that you can use the images of 2 stars and perhaps a little wishing wand, and you can use this to say, well, what are 2 things that I'm doing well, and what's something that is my where to next? And certainly that language of where to next is language that I'm using with teachers and students a lot. And I think that the notion of where to next, what is your where to next, can come up in that as well. It might be 2 stars and a question. You can shift these around, but I'm just trying to, at the moment, share some that perhaps could be used from K right through to 12. Jigsaw, if you haven't used that as a thinking routine, to jigsaw is to can be used if you have, say, 4 different readings, and you give a reading to each person, and then they read together with, so all the 1s together, all the 2s together, all the 3s together, all the 4s together. They then discuss that reading, and then they come back to their group, their 1, 2, 3, 4, and rather than the whole group having to read and decipher that information, they share back that information. And much like the thinking routines, it provides a structure. Everyone has a job to do, and then everyone has to feed back and has to question and has a role to play. So if you're doing any type of jigsaw method, whether it's a reading or whether it's a specific targeted role, everyone needs to understand what their role is and also what they have to do. So if they are feeding back, it's really important that they know that up front, because they'll certainly be concentrating a lot more in order to feed back. Headlines is a great routine that it reminds me of when I'm doing my PhD and doing the writing out 100,000 words, that we have a thing at the University of Melbourne called 3-minute thesis. And so very much in the green zone, what it does is it means you have to articulate your 100,000 words in 3 minutes. So headlines is a lot like that. It might be at the end of a unit, at the end of a day. And as a group, they need to come up with a headline, or perhaps it's a tweet with 120 characters that they have to write out with a little Twitter handle, or one headline, one newspaper headline that articulates the thinking of the group as they evaluate their day or they evaluate a unit. Headlines is wonderful because it is very much that articulation of many thoughts and ideas, but just into one sentence. So there's a whole world of thinking routines and structures for talk. There are a couple of my favorites. As I said, you can contact me for more. But perhaps as a starting point, if you're not using them, just think about 1 or 2 that you can have a go at. I will send through each of the ones that I've popped up there with a bit more information so you can read about it too. Another strategy, exit tickets. So exit tickets are a wonderful way to think about formative assessment, as well as just to think about, well, what did the students actually learn? So at the end of a lesson, to confirm progress, it may be a one sentence that they need to write out, or it may be, and it can be done either in pairs or individually, but alternatively, there's some wonderful automated feedback systems that are online as well. So we really want to maximize technology here. So it can either be the simple use of having a little piece of paper that you may have already written a question on. It may be a blank piece of paper, but before students are walking out the door to lunch, or at the end of the day, or at the end of a lesson, that they're able to feed back where they're at and to really demonstrate their understanding. And as I said, it could be done in groups. So it is about sharing this, and I wouldn't be doing it the same way all the time, but things like Kahoots or Socrative are great tools to use. So they're two that I would suggest would be really practical ways if you haven't given those a go. And again, if you've got even better suggestions, I would love to hear how you're using them in your school context. Circle time is something that I've seen used so effectively, and some people have been using circle time since their very first year of teaching and from the beginning. And it's about a really structured way of a whole class discussion, and more recently in the way of restorative practice. That we can use circle time with specific cards that guide talk, or we can be talking about something. But the idea behind circle time is that each person in the circle has a go. Now, they can pass, but I would certainly be encouraging the people who are passing a lot to be able to speak up, if not this time, definitely next time, but can be certainly used in an academic or emotional or behavioural component to address things that are going on at school. But a really nice way to bring students together to be able to see each other, look each other in the eye, and speak as a whole group. So circle time's a great one if you're not using that. Conferencing. So how can you bring together parents, or how can you bring together peers? So three-way conferences can be done, obviously, with parents, and maybe certainly done in your school context, but it may even be peers coming together to conference on a piece of work. But importantly, a really nice way to have a peer assessment, or a parent becoming part of the learning process and becoming part of the conversation, is a three-way conference with teachers, students, and parents. But certainly that strategy can be used within class as well. Feedback. Now, there will be more sessions on feedback that will go a lot deeper into feedback, but providing opportunities for students, feedback, teacher talk, and student voice certainly align together. And we want to, one suggestion that I've got as far as strategies is to watch Austin's Butterfly and discuss timely and specific targeted feedback. So if we go back to that Graham Nuttall quote about students gaining feedback from each other and so much of that being inaccurate, we want to be able to share with students the importance of really specific and targeted feedback and what that looks like. So Austin's Butterfly is quite an old video, but I think it's really useful, and you can actually show the students that video. I will attach that video, or you can certainly look up Austin's Butterfly. And I think that just that notion of students teaching students to give each other feedback is so important. So come to the end of the presentation, and you can contact me at any time. I would absolutely welcome your emails, and my details are on there. So I would love to hear about your journey. I hope that you have the most wonderful time as part of this very exciting network. I look forward to sharing more about student voice with you in the future, and any questions, please guide them to me, and you can find more resources on the website that align to the things that we've discussed today. Thanks. Bye.